Okay, let's unpack this. Have you ever looked at a complex global standard or, a really dense contract and just wished someone could give you the executive summary? Like the need to know bits, maybe with a side of, wow, I didn't know that. Oh, well, that's exactly what we're doing today. Today, we're embarking on a deep dive into a document that forms the very backbone, really, of countless construction projects worldwide, the FIDIC Red Book 2017. For those of you already navigating the complexities of global construction, or maybe looking to sharpen your understanding of how massive engineering feats are managed, well, this deep dive is for you.
Yes, and what's truly fascinating here, I think, is observing how these seemingly dry legal clauses aren't just rules on paper. They form a living, breathing framework for collaboration and intricate risk management on projects ranging from, towering skyscrapers to vast bridges. It's quite something. Our mission today really is to distill the core insights from this FIDIC Red Book 2017. We'll focus on its structure, the pivotal roles involved, essential project processes, and perhaps most importantly, how it helps navigate the inevitable challenges and even potential disputes in complex construction.
Right. We're going to explore how this document standardizes global construction practices, who the absolute key players are, how disagreements are proactively avoided, and then, if necessary, robustly resolved. We'll even touch on how modern innovations like building information modeling or BIM fit seamlessly into this established framework. Get ready for some genuine aha moments, I think, as we peel back the layers. So let's really start at the beginning then. What exactly is FIDIC, and why has their Red Book become such a global force? A veritable Bible, some might say, in the world of construction contracts.
Okay, so FIDIC, it stands for the Fédération Internationale des Ingénieurs Conseils,
Which translates to?
the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, and they are the sole copyright owner of their publications, which are, interestingly, meticulously protected by international conventions. Think the Berne Convention, TRIPS-X Agreement, WIPO Copyright Treaty, alongside, of course, national intellectual property laws globally.
So it's not just a suggestion then. This copyright thing is serious.
Oh, absolutely. It's not just a legal nicety. It means no part of a FIDIC publication can be reproduced, translated, or adapted without their explicit written permission. Usually that's in the form of a license to amend. And this rigid control, it ensures the integrity and consistent interpretation of their contract forms worldwide. That's absolutely critical for multinational projects, you see. Now, the Red Book specifically, its official title is Conditions of Contract for Construction for Building and Engineering Works Designed by the Employer. And the latest edition we're looking at is from 2017. It's one of FIDIC's 3 core standard forms, and it's specifically tailored for projects where the employer, that's the party commissioning the work, takes the lead on the design.
Okay, so there are different books for different scenarios.
Precisely. The other 2 main forms are designed for plant and design-build projects, and then for EPC turnkey projects. Each addresses different project delivery methods. But the overarching philosophy, certainly of the Red Book, is to provide a meticulously fair and balanced allocation of risks and responsibilities between the employer and the contractor, who's the party executing the works. This balance is pivotal. It fosters a predictable and collaborative project environment, and it aims to minimize disputes before they even really begin.
That's a powerful description. But for someone just maybe dipping their toes into this world, what's the core philosophy behind it? What problem was the Red Book really designed to solve at its root, especially for these employer-designed projects?
Well, at its root, the Red Book, and really all FIDI contracts, are about standardizing best practices in international construction. It's hard to overstate that. Before FIDI gained prominence, every major project often meant starting from scratch with contract drafting, which, as you can imagine, led to huge inefficiencies, inconsistencies, and a really high propensity for disputes, especially when you're working across different legal cultures.
A real headache, I imagine.
Exactly. So the Red Book steps in as this globally recognized neutral template. Its core philosophy, particularly for employer-designed works, is essentially that the party best able to control a risk should bear that risk. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, logical.
So, since the employer provides the design in the Red Book scenario, they bear the primary design risk.
Yeah.
And that clarity, it significantly reduces ambiguity and facilitates clear communication. It acts almost like a universal translator for contractual relationships across borders. It streamlines negotiations and provides a structured approach to common construction scenarios, managing delays, handling unforeseen site conditions, you name it. It fosters trust and efficiency. Without this kind of standardized framework, every project would essentially be reinventing the wheel, leading to increased costs, delays, and just a minefield of legal complications.
So it's essentially a universally recognized set of rules for construction projects where the employer handles the design, acting as a kind of global lingua franca for the whole industry.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. And the version in English, by the way, is considered the official and authentic text for translation purposes, which is a really critical point for international projects, just to ensure legal precision and consistent interpretation across different jurisdictions.
Right, clarity is key. Now here's where it gets, for me anyway, really interesting. The Red Book isn't just one monolithic document, is it? It has these two main parts, general conditions and particular conditions. What's the distinction there, and why is that structure so fundamental?
Ah, yes. That structure is, in fact, one of the ingenious aspects of FIDI contracts. It allows for both global consistency and local flexibility. It's quite clever. The general conditions are FIDI standardized rules, the core principles. As we discussed, they're fiercely protected by copyright and trademark, and FIDIC explicitly states they may not be changed without specific written consent, usually in the form of that license to amend we talked about.
So pretty rigid then.
Very. Think of them as the bedrock principles, the universal framework that defines the roles, responsibilities, and mechanisms that FIDIC has meticulously crafted to create that fair and balanced contract. Then you have the particular conditions, which is where the contract gets customized for a specific project. And this part is further divided into two subsections: Part A, contract data, and Part B, special provisions.
Okay, let's break those down. Part A.
Part A, the contract data, is essentially a fill-in-the-blanks section. This is where you insert specific project details, things like the names and addresses of the employer and engineer, the exact time for completion, the duration of the defects notification period, percentages for advance payments or retention money, details on electronic communication systems. You get the idea. It's about providing those unique, project-specific data points within the established framework.
Got it. So Part B, the special provisions. That sounds like where the real changes happen.
That's right. Part B is where genuine amendments or additions to the general conditions are made to suit the unique needs of a project, or maybe to comply with specific local laws. However, and this is critical, these changes must align with FIDIC's golden principles.
Golden principles, what are those?
There's a set of guidelines FID introduced to ensure that any amendments made don't undermine the core balance and fairness of the contract. They're designed to ensure that the contract remains recognizable as a FIDIC contract and maintains its fair and balanced character. It stops people from completely gutting the standard form while still calling it FIDIC. So if an amendment is made in the special provisions, it always overrules the general conditions for that specific clause, but it should do so carefully, respecting those principles.
That analogy you used before, the operating system and apps, really makes sense for understanding the structure. But if the general conditions are truly meant to be inviolable, does that ever limit, the bespoke nature or innovative approaches sometimes needed for truly unique infrastructure projects? How much wiggle room is really in those particular conditions?
That's the crux of the balancing act, isn't it? And it's a very good question. While the general conditions are designed for universality, the wiggle room in the particular conditions is actually substantial, provided it's done thoughtfully and adheres to those golden principles we just mentioned. The intention isn't really to stifle innovation, but to ensure that core contractual fairness and risk allocation principles aren't accidentally undermined. That's the key. For example, if you tried to shift, say, all the design risk from the employer to the contractor in Red Book contract through the special provisions.
Which would defeat the whole point of the Red Book.
Exactly. You'd be fundamentally changing the nature of a Red Book contract, likely violating a golden principle, and frankly, creating an unbalanced document that might just become a source of major disputes later on. The real challenge for project drafters is to customize without fundamentally altering the DNA, the essence of the FEIC form. That's why FEIC's own guidance notes strongly advise drafters to seek proper legal and engineering advice when preparing special provisions.
Makes sense. Get the experts involved.
Absolutely. It ensures completeness and consistency and, critically, avoids inadvertently altering that carefully balanced structure of obligations and risks that FIDIC cases work so hard to create. Altering the general conditions directly or making thoughtless changes in the particular conditions can unintentionally upset that delicate balance. It can lead to unforeseen legal consequences, increased claims, costly disputes. It's a common trap, actually. It's truly a testament to the structure that it can be adapted, but it requires real expertise to do it right.
So beyond just being a rule book, what's the ultimate goal here? What deep-seated problems do FIDIC contracts solve for someone embarking on a major construction project?
They solve several critical problems, especially inherent in complex construction, particularly projects operating across different legal jurisdictions or involving multiple international parties. Fundamentally, they provide a globally recognized and consistent framework for managing contractual relationships.
Yeah.
That significantly reduces ambiguity, right, and facilitates clear, unambiguous communication between all parties.
Like that universal translator idea.
Exactly. Imagine trying to build a bridge between two countries, with contractors from a third, financiers from a fourth, all operating under different domestic legal frameworks.
Mm.
FET provides that common language. This standardization helps everyone involved, employer, contractor, engineer, understand their rights, their obligations, the agreed-upon processes. For example, by offering a structured approach to common construction scenarios, managing delays, addressing defects, handling unforeseen site conditions, resolving disputes, FIDIC contracts often prevent potential conflicts from escalating in the first place. They provide predefined mechanisms and timelines for these situations. That fosters trust, efficiency. The guidance notes, for instance, they emphasize that time periods stated in the general conditions are considered by FET to be reasonable, realistic, and achievable.
Which avoids setting impossible deadlines from the start.
Precisely. It reflects a careful balance of interests, ensuring that neither party is unduly burdened by unrealistic expectations, and it promotes a fair operational environment. This common language and procedural framework, it's invaluable in a sector often plagued by misunderstandings and disputes. Ultimately, it contributes to more successful project outcomes and reduces overall project risk.
Okay, let's move into the building blocks. Every specialized field has its own language, its jargon, and construction contracts are certainly no different. The Red Book has a whole section dedicated to definitions. Which ones are absolutely critical for us to understand to navigate this document and, crucially, avoid potential pitfalls?
Absolutely. Understanding these definitions is your shortcut to clarity and effective communication within a FIDIC contract. Honestly, they are the bedrock upon which all other clauses are interpreted. Many a valid claim, or indeed successful project, has hinged on the precise understanding of these terms. Let's look at a few key ones. First, notice. This one is critical and often a legal tripwire. It means a written communication, okay? But it's not just any email or casual letter. It must be explicitly identified as a notice and delivered in specific ways, either a paper original signed by an authorized representative or perhaps an electronic original generated from an authorized system stated in the contract data.
So very specific format requirements.
Very specific, and many actions, claims, responses throughout the contract are triggered by the giving or receiving of a notice in this specific way. Without proper notification within the strict deadline, certain rights or entitlements might simply be forfeited. I can't tell you how many valid claims have been lost just because the notice wasn't given precisely as required.
Wow. Okay, what's next?
DEB. That stands for Dispute Avoidance Adjudication Board. This acronym is central to FIDIC's proactive approach to dispute resolution. The DAB is a formal body, either a sole member or a board of three, jointly appointed by the parties. Their role isn't just resolving disputes once they've escalated, it's also providing informal assistance to avoid them in the first place, and issuing binding decisions on disputes referred to them. We'll definitely dig into their role more later.
Okay, DAAB. Got it.
Then there's the Defects Notification Period, or DNP.
Yeah.
This is a crucial period that kicks in after the works, or a section of them, are taken over by the employer. If it's not explicitly stated in the contract data, this period is typically 1 year. It's the time frame during which the contractor is responsible for completing any outstanding work and remedying any notified defects or damage.
The warranty period, essentially.
Sort of, yes. It's calculated from the date of completion of the works, or section, and it can be extended under specific conditions, which can sometimes be a point of contention itself. Next, time for completion. Pretty straightforward, but vital. This defines the absolute deadline for the contractor to complete the works or a specified section. It's the number of days stated in the contract data, calculated from the commencement date. This period can be extended under specific conditions like variations or employer delays, as per subclause 8.5. But if the contractor fails to meet this deadline, delay damages apply, as stipulated under subclause 8.8. These are pre-agreed damages, importantly.
Liquidated damages, right?
Yeah.
Not proving actual loss.
Exactly, liquidated damages. Then variation. This refers to any change to the works formally instructed by the engineer under Clause 13. Now, while it sounds straightforward and provides crucial flexibility, it's actually one of the most frequent sources of dispute on projects. It covers changes in quality, levels, dimensions, omissions, additional work, changes to sequence or timing.
So basically any change.
Pretty much any change instructed. The challenge often lies not in whether a variation is instructed, but in how it's valued and whether the contractor genuinely incurred additional cost or delay. That often triggers a separate, complex claim process itself, which brings us to claim. This is a formal request or assertion by one party to the other for an entitlement or relief under the contract or otherwise connected to it. It's important to differentiate this from a dispute. A dispute specifically arises when a claim is rejected either wholly or partly by the other party or by the engineer.
Ah, okay, so claim first, then dispute if it's rejected.
Precisely. And the claiming party must give that notice of claim promptly, typically within 28 days of becoming aware of the event. We cannot emphasize that 28-day rule enough. Let's see. Contract data. We touched on this. It's those specific pages, Part A of the particular conditions, where all the project-specific info names, dates, percentages must be inserted. Makes the generic specific. Contractor's documents, it's a broad term, encompasses all technical submissions prepared by the contractor. Drawings, specs, calculations, manuals like operation and maintenance manual, digital files, computer programs, crucial for execution and operation. And finally, the engineer. This is the person appointed by the employer to act as the engineer for the contract. Now, while appointed by the employer, the engineer has this crucial role under subclause 3.7. When making agreements or determinations between the parties, the engineer shall act neutrally between the parties and shall not be deemed to act for the employer.
That impartiality piece, again.
Yes. It's vital for fair contract administration. They issue instructions, review documents, manage payments, and generally facilitate the project without bias. Or at least that's the intention.
It certainly sounds like legal precision is paramount, and those guidance notes you mentioned about altering definitions,
Right.
they sound like a serious warning. Expert, have you encountered situations where seemingly minor changes to these definitions have had unforeseen, maybe even catastrophic consequences for a project?
Oh, absolutely. It's a classic example, really, of where attempting to improve or maybe simplify FIDIC's carefully crafted language can just backfire spectacularly. I've seen cases where altering a seemingly innocuous definition, say of plant or materials, inadvertently shifted liability for quality control or even ownership during transit, which then led to protracted disputes worth millions.
Just from changing a definition.
Just from tweaking a definition. Or maybe defining day differently from the AFJAC standard, which then just ripples through dozens of time-related clauses in unpredictable ways. The guidance notes explicitly state, and I quote, "In general, changes should not be made to the definitions as this could have serious consequences on the interpretation of the documents." This isn't just a suggestion. It underscores how interconnected the AFJAC clauses are. Altering a definition in one place can ripple through the entire document, causing unintended ambiguities, shifting liabilities in ways that undermine the contract's fundamental fairness, and often lead to costly litigation. This is a very, very common trap, unfortunately.
Good warning. Now, with so many documents involve specifications, drawings, schedules, contract data, what happens if there's a conflict? If something in the drawings contradicts the specification, is there a hierarchy, or is it just a free-for-all when inconsistencies pop up?
No, thankfully, it's definitely not a free-for-all. That would be chaos. This is addressed explicitly and precisely in subclause 1.5, which sets out the priority of documents. And this hierarchy is absolutely crucial for resolving any ambiguities or discrepancies that might arise between the various contractual components. The intention is to provide a clear roadmap for interpretation, minimizing potential disputes from conflicting information.
Okay, so what's the pecking order?
Generally, the order of precedence is very specific. First, you have the formal instruments that cement the agreement itself, the letter of acceptance, then the letter of tender, and then the contract agreement. These contain the fundamental deal. After those, the conditions of contract take precedence, and that includes both the general and the particular conditions.
Okay.
Then comes the specification, detailing the technical requirements, followed by the drawings, the visual representation. Next are the schedules, like bills of quantities or activity schedules. And finally, the joint venture, JV undertaking, if the contractor happens to be a JV.
So a very clear letter. What happens if someone finds a mistake?
Good question. If an ambiguity or discrepancy is found by either party, that party is required to promptly give a notice to the engineer describing the issue. Upon receiving such notice, or if the engineer discovers an issue him or herself, the engineer is empowered, under subclause 3.5, to issue the necessary clarification or instruction to resolve it. And what's particularly interesting is that the special provisions, Part B, can even define a hierarchy within the specification itself if it's made up of multiple documents.
Wow, layers within layers.
Exactly. It allows for an even finer level of control over interpretation for highly complex projects, where the specification might be broken down into numerous sub-documents. This systematic approach is designed to prevent small inconsistencies from escalating into major arguments.
Makes sense. Let's talk about the key players then. We have the employer, the contractor, and the engineer. We've touched on them, but let's really nail down their core responsibilities and how they interact. And maybe in the messy reality of a construction site, where do these perfectly defined roles most often rub against each other? Are there common areas of misunderstanding or friction that FEDIC aims to mitigate, but which still frequently lead to issues in practice?
The million-dollar question indeed. Understanding this triad employer, contractor, engineer is absolutely central to how FIDI contracts function in practice. Their clearly defined roles and responsibilities are what enable complex projects to move forward with a structured approach. But their interactions, well, that's where the rubber truly meets the road, as you say. First, the employer, the party commissioning the work, the client with the vision, essentially. Their primary responsibilities, detailed mainly in Clause 2, are foundational, providing right of access to the site, subclause 2.1. This is non-negotiable. The employer must give the contractor access and possession of all parts of the site within the time specified in the contract data.
And if they don't?
If they fail to do so, it can, and frequently does, entitle the contractor to an extension of time, EOT, and/or payment of cost plus profit, meaning their direct costs, plus an agreed-upon percentage for overheads and profit. This is a common early flashpoint if land acquisition or permits get delayed.
Okay, crucial one. What else for the employer?
Providing assistance, subclause 2.2. This involves assisting the contractor with obtaining permits, permissions, licenses, approvals required by local laws, especially for delivery and export of goods, customs clearances, things like that. Ensuring cooperation, subclause 2.3. The employer is responsible for ensuring their own personnel and any other contractors they employ on or near the site cooperate with the main contractor's efforts. Vital to avoid site clashes, logistical nightmares. Making financial arrangements, subclause 2.4. The employer must demonstrate they have secured sufficient financial resources to meet their payment obligations under the contract, often done via guarantees or proof of funds. Critical for contractor confidence. And employer-supplied materials and equipment, subclause 2.6. If the employer is providing any materials or equipment, they're responsible for making them available, though the contractor assumes responsibility for their care once they take them over.
Okay, that's the employer side. Now the contractor.
Right, the contractor, the party executing the works. Their general obligations are extensive, mostly detailed in Clause 4, carrying out the works, subclause 4.1, their core duty, obviously. Execute the works according to the contract, ensure fitness for purpose for any design they undertake, and comply with all applicable laws, providing performance security, subclause 4.2. The contractor must provide a guarantee, typically from a bank, to secure their performance. Usually remains valid until the performance certificate is issued. It's a significant financial obligation for them. Appointing a contractor's representative, subclause 4.3. This individual is crucial. Must be qualified, experienced, competent, fluent in the language of communications. Their entire time must be dedicated to directing the contractor's performance. They act on behalf of the contractor for notices, instructions, the main point of contact.
The go-to person on site.
Yes, exactly. Preparing contractors' documents, subclause 4.4. All those technical submissions. Drawings, specs, calculations, digital files, manuals, including as-built records and operation maintenance manuals. These must comply with the spec and be submitted for the engineer's review. Health and safety obligations, subclause 4.8. Hugely important. The contractor is solely responsible for the health and safety of everyone on site, providing fencing, lighting, safe access, complying with regulations. Must appoint a qualified health and safety officer, a very high-risk area. Implementing quality management and compliance verification systems, subclause 4.9. We'll touch on this more, but they must prepare and implement a QM system within 28 days of commencement. Includes procedures for planning, inspections, tests, corrective actions, plus a separate compliance verification system. Requires regular internal audits too. Site security and operations, subclause 4.21, 4.22. Contractor's job to secure the site and manage their operations. And managing subcontractors, subclause 5.1. The contractor is fully responsible for the work of all subcontractors as if it were their own. Usually needs the engineer's prior consent for proposed subcontractors.
Lots on the contractor's plate. Now, the engineer. We know they're appointed by the employer, but meant to be neutral.
Yes, the engineer. acts as an impartial administrator, though appointed by the employer. Their role is mainly in Clause 3. Engineer's duties and authority, subclause 3.2, vested with the authority necessary to act under the contract. Issuing instructions, subclause 3.5. The engineer can issue instructions. If an instruction is a variation, Clause 13 applies. If the contractor thinks an instruction is a variation but isn't stated as such, they must give immediate notice. Agreement or determination, subclause 3.7. This is that crucial impartial function again. When making agreements or determinations between the parties, the engineer shall act neutrally and shall be deemed to act for the employer. Each agreement determination is binding unless corrected via dispute resolution. If parties can't agree, the engineer makes a determination.
So they're like the first referee.
In a way, yes. They also review contractors' documents, subclause 4.4, issuing notices of no objection or rejection. They manage payments, clause 14, by issuing interim and final payment certificates, and they maintain records of meetings, subclause 3.8. Now, to your excellent question about friction points. While the engineer is theoretically neutral, being appointed and paid by the employer creates a subtle but constant tension. It just does. The role demands immense integrity. Common flashpoints definitely occur during determinations involving cost or time claims. The contractor might perceive bias even if the engineer is trying their best to be fair.
Understandable.
It's a key reason why the DAB exists, really, as the next level of neutral arbiter.
Yeah.
Other common areas of tension. Inadequate site access from the employer, that's a big one. Or contractor delays in submitting critical documents like the program. FDIC's detailed rules try to provide a framework for these conflicts, but, the human element and commercial pressures mean they're almost inevitable sometimes.
Okay, we've established the foundation, the players, the framework, but in large-scale construction, the truly unexpected is often, well, guaranteed, from what's hidden beneath the ground to sudden changes in the legal landscape. Expert, how does FI, a document known for its predictability, actually handle those inevitable curveballs, like finding unforeseen physical conditions or new regulations coming into play?
That's a crucial point because, yes, even the best plans meet reality on site. FIDIC contracts are actually meticulously designed to anticipate and provide clear mechanisms for dealing with such unforeseeable events, aiming to ensure fairness and manage the associated risk.
Before we get to the unexpected, how does a project officially get started under FIDI? What's the first big hurdle the contractor faces beyond just, breaking ground?
Right, the kickoff. It officially starts with the engineer's notice stating the commencement date, as per subclause 8.1. This notice has to be given not less than 14 days before the actual commencement date, and typically this date falls within 42 days after the contractor receives the letter of acceptance. So there's a defined window. From this precise commencement date, the clock starts ticking on the time for completion, and the contractor is obligated to proceed with the works with due expedition and without delay. Okay, so the starting gun fires. What's that first hurdle? The first major hurdle, and a truly critical early submission for the contractor, is the program, outlined in subclause 8.3. This detailed plan needs to be submitted to the engineer within 28 days after receiving that initial commencement notice. So pretty quickly. And this program isn't just a generic schedule. It has to detail how the contractor plans to execute the entire works within the stipulated time for completion. It's often required to be prepared using specific programming software, maybe stated in the specification, or at least software acceptable to the engineer.
So it's a formal, detailed plan.
Very. And what's important to remember is that this isn't a static document set in stone. It's a living blueprint. The contractor must submit revised programs whenever the initial one ceases to reflect actual progress, or maybe becomes inconsistent with their contractual obligations. This initial program forms the baseline against which progress, delays, and extensions of time will later be assessed, making its accuracy and timely submission absolutely paramount, and frankly, often a source of early claims if not handled well.
So it's not just about starting work, but having a clear, agreed-upon plan right from the get-go, a living blueprint for the project, as you say.
Precisely. And that blueprint isn't just for show, it's the baseline against which progress is meticulously measured. And importantly, it's linked to how quality is continuously monitored and assured throughout the entire project's execution.
Let's talk about that monitoring. How is progress and quality managed day to day?
Okay, several key mechanisms here. First, setting out. Subclause 4.7. The contractor bears significant responsibility here. They have to accurately set out the works in relation to the employer's reference points, benchmarks, lines, levels. They must verify the accuracy of these reference points before use and promptly report any errors to the engineer. If an error is found in the reference item specified, say on drawings, the contractor needs to give notice within 28 days of the commencement date. If it's an items issued later by the engineer, notice must be given ASAP.
And if the error wasn't the contractor's fault?
Good point. If an experienced contractor would not have discovered such an error beforehand, then any measures the contractor has to take to rectify it are considered a variation under subclause 13.3.1. And if that causes delay or cost, the contractor is entitled to an extension of time and/or payment of cost plus profit, subject to the claims procedure. This highlights the importance of thorough initial site checks, and it's a prime example of shared risk allocation. Then there's quality management and compliance verification systems, subclause 4.9. This is a two-pronged approach to ensuring quality. It's about systematic assurance, not just random checks.
Two systems. What's the difference?
First, the quality management system, QM system, subclause 4.9.1. The contractor must prepare and implement a QM system tailored for the works, submitting it within 28 days of commencement. This outlines their procedures for quality planning, resource management, inspection, and testing protocols, and how they'll handle corrective actions for nonconformities. It's dynamic, requiring updates. The engineer can flag failures in implementation, which must be remedied. Plus, the contractor has to do internal audits of the QM system at least every 6 months, reporting results and improvements to the engineer.
Okay, that's the overall system. What's the second part?
The second part is the Compliance Verification System, CVS, subclause 4.9.2. This system is specifically about demonstrating that the design, if applicable, materials, employer-supplied materials, plant, work, and workmanship all comply with the contract requirements. It must include methods for reporting the results of all inspections and tests. If any inspection or test reveals noncompliance, then subclause 7.5 on defects and rejection kicks in, potentially leading to rejection of plant, materials, or workmanship. The contractor compiles a complete set of compliance verification documentation for the works or sections.
That's a huge amount of procedural detail on quality. What kind of challenges do contractors typically face in getting these systems approved and, more importantly, effectively implemented on a sprawling project? Is it just paperwork?
That's a great practical question. The biggest challenge often isn't the theory, the paperwork itself, but the practical implementation and getting that initial buy-in from everyone on site. It requires significant upfront investment in processes and personnel training, in documentation systems. Engineers might reject the initial QM or CVS submissions if they're too generic or maybe don't adequately address project specifics. That's common. Then there's the ongoing challenge of maintaining the system's rigor amidst the real pressures of project schedules and deadlines. Those internal audits, for example, they need to be genuine assessments, not just box-ticking exercises, because their results directly impact whether the engineer is satisfied with compliance. It really demands a culture of meticulousness, which can be hard to maintain consistently.
I can imagine. What about proving it all works at the end?
Ah, yes. That brings us to test on completion, Clause 9. These are vital checks before the employer takes over the works, ensuring the project actually performs as specified. The contractor is responsible for preparing a test program and giving at least 21 days notice to the engineer before the readiness date for each test on completion. The engineer reviews this program and must give a notice of no objection or be deemed to have done so after 14 days before tests can start.
What if the engineer doesn't show up?
If the engineer doesn't attend a scheduled test despite proper notice, the test can proceed anyway and are deemed to have been made in the engineer's presence, a practical safeguard. Now, if the tests on completion are unduly delayed by the contractor, the engineer can issue a notice requiring the test to be carried out within 21 days. Failure to comply can lead to the engineer issuing a taking over certificate anyway, if the employer requests it, or potentially even rejecting a section of the works if the failure means it can't be used for its intended purpose. That then triggers the severe remedies under Clause 11 for failure to remedy defects. This clause basically stops contractors from dragging their feet on proving the system works.
Okay, now back to those unexpected curveballs. What happens when the unexpected throws a wrench in the works? Like finding unexpected ground conditions or new regulations coming into play.
All right, those curveballs. FIDI provides specific mechanisms. Let's take unforeseeable physical conditions, subclause 4.1 feet first. This clause specifically defines physical conditions, natural conditions, man-made obstructions, pollutants encountered at the site, including subsurface and hydrological conditions. Importantly, it excludes climatic conditions at the site and their effects. Those are typically covered elsewhere or just part of the contractor's normal risk assessment.
So, bad weather doesn't count as unforeseeable physical conditions.
Generally not under this specific clause, no. If the contractor encounters physical conditions they consider truly unforeseeable by an experienced contractor at the base date that's contractually defined, usually 28 days before the tender deadline, and these conditions will adversely affect progress or increase cost. They must follow a specific procedure. Prompt notice to the engineer describing the conditions, then detailed particulars. The engineer then critically assesses, were these conditions really unforeseeable? This often involves digging into geological reports, ground investigations, expert opinions.
A potentially contentious assessment.
It can be. If they were unforeseeable, the engineer can adjust the contract price or the time for completion. What's also fascinating here is the engineer has discretion to review whether other physical conditions encountered elsewhere on the site were maybe more favorable than foreseen. If so, these reductions in cost can be taken into account, ensuring a balanced overall adjustment. Though, importantly, the net effect of all adjustments for unforeseeable conditions cannot result in a net reduction in the contract price overall. It prevents parties being unfairly burdened or benefiting from stuff no one could reasonably predict.
Interesting balance. What about changes in the law?
That's covered by adjustments for changes in laws, subclause 13.6. This addresses the impact of legal or regulatory changes after that specific base date. The contract price gets adjusted to account for any increases or decreases in cost, resulting from changes in the country's laws, maybe judicial interpretations, or even changes in permit requirements after that base date.
So the risk of future legal changes isn't entirely on the contractor.
Correct. It ensures the contractor isn't unfairly penalized or rewarded for legislative changes beyond their control. If such a change leads to a delay, the contractor may be entitled to an EOT. Conversely, if it results in a decrease in cost, the employer is entitled to a reduction in the contract price. Either party gives notice, particulars are provided, and the engineer will either instruct a variation or request a proposal to address the necessary adjustments. It provides a vital safety net against those external legislative shifts, promoting contract stability.
Money makes the world go round, and construction projects are definitely no exception. How does payment actually work in a FIDIC contract? And maybe what's the one financial clause that tends to cause the most headaches, or where project owners and contractors most frequently find themselves at odds?
Payment. Yes, it's meticulously structured in FIDIC contracts, designed to ensure a consistent financial flow and proper accountability, but also aiming to mitigate cash flow risks for both parties. Let's walk through the key phases. First, the contract price, subclause 14.1. This is the agreed-upon total price for the works. It's deemed to cover all the contractor's obligations and everything necessary for proper execution. If the accepted contract amount includes estimated quantities, maybe in a bill of quantities, those aren't taken as final. The price gets adjusted based on actual measurements later.
Okay, the starting price. What about upfront money?
That's the advance payment, subclause 14.2. It's an initial payment made by the employer to the contractor, usually soon after the letter of acceptance, mainly to help with mobilization costs and initial cash flow. It's usually secured by an advance payment guarantee, often a bank guarantee provided by the contractor.
And how is it paid back?
Repayment happens through percentage deductions from subsequent interim payment certificates. For example, deductions might start when certified payments hit 10% of the contract amount, and then maybe 25% is deducted from each following IPC. If the advance payment isn't fully repaid before the taking over certificate or termination, the outstanding balance becomes immediately due and payable by the contractor.
Right. How does the regular payment cycle work?
That's via the application for interim payment, subclause 14.3. The contractor submits monthly statements to the engineer. These detail the estimated value of work executed and contractor's documents produced up to the end of that month. They also include any adjustments for variations, changes in laws, changes in cost, and other amounts due. These applications are absolutely critical for maintaining cash flow. They need to be supported by relevant progress reports and sufficient documentation for the engineer to actually verify the amounts claimed.
Then the engineer checks it.
Yes, leading to interim payment certificates, IPC, subclause 14.6. Based on the contractor's application and their own assessment, the engineer certifies the amounts for interim payments. These IPCs specify the amount due for work completed and other entitlements during that period. Then comes the actual payment, subclause 14.7. The employer has specific periods to make these payments. For an advance payment certificate, typically within 21 days of receipt. For IPCs, usually within 56 days after the engineer receives the contractor statement and supporting docs. The final payment certificate also has a 56-day payment period. Payments go into the nominated bank account in the specified currency. What if the employer is late paying? There's a mechanism for that. Delayed payment, subclause 14.8. If the employer fails to pay within the stipulated time, the contractor is entitled to receive financing charges, compounded monthly, on the unpaid amount during the period of delay. This acts as a penalty, compensates the contractor, and is a pretty strong incentive for the employer to pay on time.
Okay. What about holding money back? Retention.
Yes, retention money, subclause 14.9, a common practice. A percentage of the value of work certified in the IPCs is retained by the employer. This acts as a security against defects in outstanding work. Typically, half the retention money is released after the taking over certificate is issued for the works. The remaining half is released after the performance certificate, which signifies the end of the defects notification period. The engineer can withhold release if work remains outstanding under Clause 11.
And the final payment, the grand reconciliation.
That involves the final statement and final payment certificate. Subclauses 14.11, 14.13. Within 84 days of the date of completion, the contractor submits a statement at completion. Then, within 56 days after the issue of the performance certificate, the contractor submits a draft final statement to the engineer, detailing everything they believe is finally due. The engineer reviews this, and after agreement or determination, issues the final payment certificate, FPC, within 28 days of receiving that final statement. The FPC states the amount finally due. And here's a key point. Unless the contractor makes a claim within 56 days of receiving the FPC, they are deemed to have accepted the certified amounts. This finality is important for project closeout.
Okay, comprehensive. Now, back to my earlier question, which part of this payment process causes the most headaches in practice? Where do the arguments usually happen?
I'd say subclause 14.3, the application for interim payment, often causes the most friction day to day. It's just the nature of it. Contractors, understandably eager for cash flow, might sometimes overstate progress or submit incomplete documentation. Employers, keen to control costs, might scrutinize applications excessively or, worse, delay payments intentionally or unintentionally. And the engineer is caught right in the middle, needing to certify fairly based on the evidence. Disputes around the valuation of work done, especially for variations or claims included in the IPC application, are a constant source of tension. It's effectively a continuous negotiation each month, and the clarity of the submitted records and the engineer's diligence are absolutely key to avoiding disputes escalating.
That's a truly sophisticated system balancing cash flow and accountability. Now, shifting gears slightly, when is a project actually considered done under FDIC? And what happens if issues unexpectedly pop up after that formal completion?
Right, completion. In a FIDIC contract, it's a precisely defined process, culminating in what's called taking over. What happens afterwards is managed through the defects notification period, or DNP. It's definitely not just a handshake and walking away, it's a formal transition of responsibility. So, employers taking over, Clause 10. The project, or a defined section of it, is considered substantially completed when the contractor applies for a taking over certificate, TOC, under subclause 10.1. The contractor gives notice to the engineer when they believe the works are completed and ready for taking over. The engineer then has 28 days to either issue the TOC, stating the completion date and listing any minor outstanding work or defects that don't substantially affect the safe use of the works for their intended purpose. This TOC is a critical document. It marks the end of the contractor's daily risk for the care of the works. Or reject the application by giving a notice to the contractor with detailed reasons, specifying the work still needed, defects to be fixed, or documents to be submitted.
What if the engineer just doesn't respond?
FEIC anticipates that. If the engineer fails to issue the TOC or reject the application within that 28-day period, and if key conditions like completing training or submitting manuals have been met, the works are deemed to have been completed on the 14th day after the engineer received the application, and the TOC is deemed issued. It's a safeguard against engineer inaction.
Clever. Can parts be taken over separately?
Yes. Taking over can also apply to individual sections or even parts of the works, as per subclause 10.2. This is significant because once a section or part is taken over, the delay damages for the remaining works are proportionately reduced. For instance, the reduction is calculated based on the value of the taken over part relative to the value of the whole works or section. This phase taking over can be very beneficial on large, complex projects. allows the employer to use completed bits, and reduces the contractor's exposure to damages.
Okay, so taking over is the formal completion. What about those post-completion issues? The defects notification period.
Exactly. Defects after taking over, Clause 11. This is where the defects notification period, DNP, comes into play, as we defined earlier. The DNP, typically 1 year, unless stated otherwise in the contract data, begins from the date of completion certified by that taking over certificate. During this period, the contractor has a crucial ongoing responsibility under subclause 11.1. They must complete any minor work that was outstanding on the date of completion within the time stated in the TOC or as reasonably instructed. And more importantly, they must execute all work required to remedy any defects or damage they are notified about by the employer or on their behalf, on or before the DMP expiry date. These defects could be due to materials, design errors, poor workmanship, you name it. Subclause 11.2.
How does that notification work?
If a defect appears or damage occurs, the employer gives a notice to the contractor. Ideally, both parties then jointly inspect it. If the contractor believes the defect isn't their responsibility, they notify the engineer, who then determines the cause. If it's determined not to be the contractor's responsibility, it's treated as a variation, potentially leading to time and cost entitlements for the contractor.
And if the contractor just fails to fix a defect they are responsible for?
Subclause 11.4 provides the employer with several options if the contractor fails to remedy a defect within the specified time. The employer can carry out the work themselves or hire others to do it at the contractor's cost and claim these costs back. This is a common practical solution. Or the employer can decide to accept the defective work and claim a reduction in the contract price for the reduced value. Or, in really severe cases, if the defect or damage deprives the employer of substantially the whole benefit of the works, the employer may actually terminate the contract as a whole with immediate effect.
Wow, terminate after taking over.
Yes. In that scenario, the employer is entitled to recover all sums paid for the works, plus financing charges and costs for dismantling, clearing the site, returning plant and materials. It's a very serious consequence, underscoring the contractor's ongoing responsibility during the DNP, even after physical completion.
Right, that really highlights the importance of that period.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift focus to when things really go wrong. No project is perfect. Disagreements inevitably arise. How does FIDIC manage these claims, and what's the very first, often overlooked, step that can make or break a party's entitlement?
Claims are indeed an inevitable part of large projects, and FIDIC lays out a strict, systematic procedure for handling them. It acts as the formal gateway to dispute resolution. If either party, employer, or contractor believes they are entitled to any additional payment, or maybe a price reduction for the employer and/or an extension of time, EOT, or perhaps an extension of the DNP, they must follow the claim procedure outlined in subclause 20.2. And the first, most critical step, the one that's so often missed, is giving a notice of claim to the engineer.
That notice again.
That notice again. It must describe the event or circumstance giving rise to the cost, loss, or delay. And it must be given as soon as practicable, but crucially, no later than 28 days after the claiming party became aware or should have become aware of the event or circumstance, subclause 20.2.1.
28 days. That sounds incredibly strict. Is that a common pitfall for even experienced contractors, or something that surprises new entrants to the FID ecosystem?
It absolutely is a common pitfall, and yes, it surprises people constantly, even those who think they know contracts well. Many, many valid claims, even with strong merit, have been lost simply because the notice of claim was given on day 29, or maybe it wasn't specific enough, or wasn't clearly identified as a notice. Seasoned FID practitioners know this 28-day rule by heart. It's practically legendary for how unforgiving it can be.
So, miss the deadline, lose the claim, period.
Pretty much. Failure to meet it means the claiming party forfeits their entitlement to any additional payment or extension for that event, and the other party is discharged from any liability connected with it. It's harsh, but it's necessary to ensure claims are addressed promptly, not allowed to fester for months or years. It's often called a condition precedent, meaning it must be met for the entitlement to even exist.
Wow, so discipline and early communication are forced, really.
Exactly, it forces discipline. And the claiming party is also required to maintain contemporary records, subclause 20.2.3.
Contemporary records.
Records prepared at the same time or immediately after the event or circumstance giving rise to the claim. Things like site diaries, photos, emails, meeting notes. This contemporaneous documentation is vital for substantiating the claim later. Having robust record-keeping systems is paramount. After receiving the notice of claim, the engineer assesses it, often requesting additional particulars or supporting documents. The engineer then makes a determination regarding the claim. This determination is binding on both parties unless one party issues a notice of dissatisfaction, NOD, within 28 days of receiving it. That NOD then elevates the disagreement to a formal dispute, which can then be referred to the DAB. The entire claims procedure under subclause 20.2 is designed to encourage early notification, full substantiation, and prompt assessment by the engineer, ideally resolving issues before they escalate further.
Okay, so if a claim isn't resolved by the engineer's determination, or if someone issues that notice of dissatisfaction, where does it go next? This DAB sounds like a crucial step, almost like a real-time project therapist for complex issues, as you put it earlier.
It is, and your project therapist analogy is surprisingly apt. It's a hallmark of FIDIC's real-time dispute resolution philosophy, designed specifically to prevent disputes from derailing projects into those lengthy, expensive legal battles. The Dispute Avoidance Adjudication Board, DIAE, defined back in subclause 1.1.22, is that jointly appointed body, either a sole member or, more commonly on larger projects, a board of 3 suitably qualified members, subclause 21.1. Ideally, and FEI strongly recommends this, the DAB is appointed very early in the project lifecycle, usually within 28 days of the letter of acceptance, and remains in place for the entire duration of the contract. This is known as a standing DAB.
So they know the project inside out.
Exactly, that's the idea. Its primary objectives, stated right in Rule 1 of the DAB procedural rules, are precisely dispute avoidance and real-time resolution. The concept is to have an independent body, intimately familiar with the project and the parties, actively involved in monitoring progress and addressing potential issues as they arise, rather than waiting for a crisis to erupt months later.
How does the avoidance part work?
Through things like informal assistance. Subclause 21.3, Rule 1.5. This is a key proactive measure. The DAB can provide informal assistance or guidance during their regular meetings or site visits, maybe even through an informal written note, if jointly requested by the parties. Imagine the DAB sitting with both sides, reviewing a tricky site condition or a pending variation issue, and offering expert, unbiased advice before it becomes a formal claim or dispute. It encourages open discussion and resolution before disagreements harden.
That sounds incredibly useful.
It really can be. And to facilitate this, the DAB holds regular meetings and site visits, Rule 3. These visits are especially crucial at critical construction events like suspensions or terminations. The employer, contractor, and engineer are all expected to attend these sessions, ensuring the DAB stays informed about progress and potential issues. The contractor coordinates these visits.
Okay, so they're involved throughout. What happens when a formal dispute does arise?
Then we move to obtaining BAB's decision, subclause 21.4. If a dispute arises, maybe a claim is rejected, or an engineer's determination gets that. Notice of dissatisfaction, either party can formally refer the dispute to the DAA for a binding decision. There are strict timelines for this referral, too. For instance, if the dispute relates to an engineer's determination, it must be referred within 42 days of giving or receiving the NOD regarding that determination. Miss that, and the NOD lapses, making the engineer's determination final and binding. The DAB then considers the evidence from both sides and must make its decision within specific time limits, typically 84 days according to Rule 8.1 of their procedural rules.
And is that decision the final word?
Not necessarily immediately. The DAB's decision is binding on both parties unless a notice of dissatisfaction, NOD, is given by either party within 28 days of receiving the decision, subclause 21.4.4. If no NOD is given within this period, then the DAB's decision becomes final and binding on both parties. Silence means acceptance, essentially.
What if a party just ignores a binding decision?
FED has teeth here. Failure to comply, subclause 21.7. This is one of the strengths of the DAB system. If a party fails to comply with a DAB decision that has become final and binding, the other party can refer this specific failure directly to arbitration, without needing a further NOD on the underlying dispute. This fast-tracks enforcement of the DAB's authority, preventing a party from simply ignoring a binding decision they don't like. The DAB's very presence, combined with its proactive involvement in its power to issue binding decisions, genuinely encourages collaboration and early resolution. By having this expert, impartial body continuously engaged, many potential disputes are either avoided entirely or resolved quickly at project level, saving enormous amounts of time and legal fees.
That's a powerful mechanism for early resolution. But what if the DAB's decision doesn't resolve things, or one party is simply dissatisfied and issues that NOD? What's the ultimate court of appeal within the FED framework?
That's where arbitration comes in, is the ultimate backstop, the final stage. Unless the dispute is settled amicably between the parties after the DAB decision, which often happens, and subject to those conditions about NODs and failure to comply, any dispute for which the DAB decision has not become final and binding is finally settled by international arbitration. Subclause 21.6. So if a party issues that entity within the 28-day window, or maybe if the DAB fails to issue a decision within its time limits, the dispute can then proceed to arbitration.
And how does that arbitration work?
Unless the parties agree otherwise, the arbitration is conducted under the rules of arbitration of the International Chamber of Commerce, ICC, usually settled by 1 or 3 arbitrators appointed according to those rules. And it's conducted in the ruling language defined in the contract. What's crucial to understand is that the arbitrators have full power to open up, review, and revise pretty much anything, any certificate, determination, instruction, opinion, valuation of the engineer, and any decision of the DAB, unless that DAB decision has already become final and binding.
So they can look at everything fresh.
Essentially, yes. It gives the arbitration panel wide latitude to revisit the entire history of the dispute, ensuring a full and fair hearing at that final stage. The guidance notes strongly recommend selecting a neutral location for arbitration, especially for international projects, to aid enforceability.
You mentioned enforceability. Why do FIDC contracts prioritize arbitration over national courts? What's the thinking there?
That's a deliberate choice, driven by the realities of international projects. International commercial arbitration offers several distinct advantages over litigation in national courts. First, neutrality, critical when parties come from different legal jurisdictions with potentially different biases. Second, expertise. Arbitrators often have specialized knowledge in construction law and engineering, leading to more informed decisions on complex technical issues than a generalist judge might make. And perhaps most importantly, enforceability. Arbitral awards are generally much more easily enforceable across borders than court judgments, thanks to international treaties like the 1958 New York Convention. Most countries are signatories. This makes arbitration the preferred method for global construction disputes, ensuring a pathway to resolution that is both expert and globally effective.
Got it. Now, in the absolute worst-case scenario, the point of no return, perhaps, what mechanisms does FEIC provide for actually ending the contract prematurely? Termination. And what are the specific consequences for each party involved?
Termination is indeed the most severe outcome, the project ending before its natural conclusion. And FIDI provides distinct, detailed procedures for it, each with different triggers and consequences. It's designed to ensure legal clarity and fairness even when a project breaks down completely. It's never a decision taken lightly.
Okay, so how can the employer terminate?
Termination by employer, subclause 15.2. The employer can terminate under specific conditions related to the contractor's default. Grounds include things like substantial failure by the contractor to carry out their obligations, maybe persistent failure to comply with a notice to correct defects under subclause 15.1, abandonment of the works, bankruptcy or insolvency of the contractor, or if the contractor is found to have engaged in corrupt, fraudulent, collusive, or coercive practices, subclause 15.2.1.
What's the process? Do they just say, you're fired?
Not usually. Typically, the employer must first give a notice to correct, subclause 15.1. If the specified default isn't remedied within 14 days of receiving that notice, then the employer can issue a second notice to the contractor, immediately terminating the contract. However, for really serious breaches like corrupt practices or bankruptcy, the employer can terminate immediately with just a single notice.
And the consequences for the contractor?
They're significant. After termination, the contractor must immediately comply with instructions, protect the works, assign subcontracts if asked. They must deliver required goods, all contractors' documents, including design docs if they did design, and then leave the site. The employer then has the right to complete the works themselves or hire others to do so, potentially using the contractor's documents and equipment left on site. And the contractor is liable for the employer's additional costs of completing the works, any losses and damages suffered, and potentially delay damages if the works weren't taken over on time before termination. Subclause 15.2.5. Any contractor's equipment left behind can even be sold by the employer to recover payments due. So it's serious financially.
Ouch. Can the employer terminate just because they changed their mind?
Yes, there's a provision for termination for employer's convenience, subclause 15.5. This is less common but significant. It allows the employer to terminate the contract at any time simply for their convenience by giving 28 days notice.
Just like that. Seems harsh.
It can be, but the consequences are different. If the employer exercises this right, they must pay the contractor for the value of work done, the cost of plant and materials ordered, and any other losses or damages incurred by the contractor due to this termination. Crucially, this typically includes loss of profit on the unexecuted portion of the works, subclause 15.6. So the contractor is compensated more fully than in a default termination. However, it's important to note that the legality of such a termination for convenience clause can vary depending on local laws. It may not be permissible or might be restricted in some jurisdictions.
Why is that?
Well, in some civil law jurisdictions, for example, fundamental principles like good faith or abuse of right might severely restrict an employer's ability to just walk away without a legitimate reason, even if the contract text seems to allow it. It underscores why getting bespoke legal advice on the governing law is absolutely paramount before relying on or using such a clause.
Good point. Can the contractor ever terminate?
Yes, they can. Suspension and termination by contractor, Clause 16, outlines their rights, usually triggered by employer breaches. First, suspension, subclause 16.1. The contractor can suspend work or reduce the rate of work if the employer fails to make timely payments or fails to provide that reasonable evidence of financial arrangements we talked about earlier, or fails to comply with binding agreements, final engineer's determinations, or DAAB decisions. This right to suspend often serves as powerful leverage to compel the employer to fix their default.
An actual termination by the contractor?
Termination by contractor, subclause 16.2. This can happen if the employer's default is prolonged or severe. Things like prolonged suspension of the works, affecting the whole works for 84 days continuously, for instance, under subclause 8.92, or if the employer becomes bankrupt or insolvent.
And the consequences then?
If the contractor terminates due to employer default, the employer must promptly pay the contractor the value of work done, the cost of plant and materials delivered or committed to, and, crucially, any loss of profit or other losses and damages suffered by the contractor as a result of this termination, subclause 16.4. This ensures the contractor is compensated for the employer's breach that led to their termination, reflecting the principle of making the non-breaching party whole.
That's a really comprehensive breakdown of a messy situation. Which of these termination scenarios is most common in practice, and what typically drives a project to that absolute point of no return?
In practice, termination for contractor default by the employer, subclause 15.2, probably tends to be more common, particularly driven by things like persistent delays, significant quality issues, or sometimes outright abandonment. However, a significant driver, often underlying those issues, is financial distress from either side. A contractor might cease work or declare insolvency due to their own cash flow problems, making default inevitable. Or an employer might genuinely struggle to make payments, triggering the contractor's right to suspend and eventually terminate. These financial pressures, if they aren't addressed quickly and transparently, often escalate to a point where termination, despite its severe consequences for everyone involved, becomes the only viable, albeit painful, option. The ideal scenario, of course, is that the tiered dispute resolution process, especially the DAAB, resolves issues long before termination is even seriously considered. That's what it's designed for.
Right, prevention is better than cure. Okay, let's move into some special considerations. Risk is inherent in construction, we know that. How does FIDI meticulously allocate liability and ensure parties are indemnified against claims? And maybe, what are the biggest liability surprises for those new to these contracts?
You're absolutely right. Risk is central, and FIDI meticulously defines how it's allocated and managed through provisions for liability and indemnities, primarily found in Clause 17. The biggest surprise for newcomers. Often it's the sheer granularity of how liability is apportioned. It moves well beyond just general statements of responsibility. Let's look at the key parts. Responsibility for care of the works, subclause 17.1. Generally, the contractor takes full responsibility for the care of the works, goods, and their documents from the commencement date until the works, or a section part, are taken over by the employer.
So if a storm hits before handover, it's usually the contractor's problem.
Typically, yes. That risk transfers to the employer upon taking over. But then there's liability for care of the works, subclause 17.2. While the contractor has responsibility for care, their liability for loss or damage is qualified. They are liable for loss or damage they cause, including stuff that occurs after taking over, but arose from something they were liable for before taking over, however. The contractor is not liable for loss or damage caused by specific employer-attributable events.
Such as?
Things like interference with rights-of-way resulting from proper execution, the employer's use or occupation of parts of the works before completion, and crucially, faults, errors, defects, or omissions in any element of the design provided by the employer or contained in the specification drawings, provided an experienced contractor wouldn't have discovered them before tendering. It also exempts the contractor from liability for acts or defaults of the employer's personnel or the employer's other contractors. If one of these employer-attributable events causes damage, the contractor rectifies it, but it's treated as a variation, entitling them to time and/or cost. So the employer bears the risk for defects in their own design or actions. This is a common point of contention if design issues emerge late in the project.
Okay, what about intellectual property? Patents, copyrights?
Covered in intellectual and industrial property rights. Subclause 17.3. The employer indemnifies the contractor against claims arising from the contractor simply complying with the employer's specification or drawings. Conversely, the contractor indemnifies the employer against other infringements arising from the contractor's execution of the works or their use of equipment. There are rules about who takes charge of settling claims, too.
What about general third-party claims? Someone gets injured on site.
That falls under indemnities by contractor, subclause 17.4. The contractor gives broad indemnities to the employer and their personnel. This covers third-party claims for bodily injury, sickness, death, or damage to property, other than the works themselves, provided these arise out of the contractor's execution of the works and are attributable to the contractor's negligence, willful act, or breach of contract. And crucially, if the contractor is responsible for the design of any part of the permanent works under subclause 4.1, they also specifically indemnify the employer against acts, errors, or omissions in that design that result in the works not being fit for their intended purpose, a key design liability point.
Does the employer give indemnities too?
Yes, indemnities by employer, subclause 17.5. The employer indemnifies the contractor and their personnel for similar things attributable to the employer's negligence, willful act, or breach, and also for damage arising from those employer-attributable events we listed under 17.2. But perhaps the most fascinating part is shared indemnities, subclause 17.6. This reflects a more nuanced approach, acknowledging that sometimes both parties contribute to a loss or damage. This clause stipulates that a party's liability to indemnify the other is reduced proportionally to the extent that the other party's actions or responsibilities contributed to the damage, loss, or injury.
So it's not always all or nothing.
Exactly. It promotes a fair allocation of shared responsibility, moving away from a potentially unfair all-or-nothing approach. It aligns better with modern risk management principles where concurrent causes are common. This is often a surprise because many expect one party to simply take all the blame in any given situation.
That shared indemnities clause is a real eye-opener, acknowledging the complexities of real-world causation. Now, what about truly unforeseeable and uncontrollable events? Things like natural disasters, civil unrest. Does FIDIC have a force majeure clause, and how does it differentiate these from other unforeseen events we discuss?
Yes, it does, though FIDIC uses the specific term exceptional event instead of the traditional force majeure. This is defined carefully in subclause 18.1. An exceptional event refers to an event or circumstance that is beyond a party's control, which the party could not reasonably have provided against before entering the contract, which could not reasonably have been avoided or overcome once it occurred, and importantly is not substantially attributable to the other party. It's quite a stringent definition.
What kind of things qualify?
The clause explicitly lists examples: war, hostilities, invasion, act of foreign enemies, rebellion, terrorism, revolution, insurrection, military or usurped power, civil war, riot, commotion, or disorder by persons other than the contractor's personnel or subcontractors. Also, strikes or lockouts not solely involving the contractor's personnel or subcontractors. So a general industry strike might qualify. A strike just by the contractor's own workforce generally doesn't. And encountering munitions of war, explosive materials, ionizing radiation, radioactivity, unless caused by the contractor's own use of such materials.
What about extreme weather, like a massive flood or hurricane?
Interestingly, the guidance notes clarify that exceptionally adverse climatic conditions are not considered an exceptional event for the purposes of contract suspension or termination under this specific clause.
Really? Why not?
While those conditions might still justify an extension of time, EOT, under a different clause, subclause 8.5, they don't trigger the more severe consequences of an exceptional event under clause 18. The thinking is that severe weather, to some extent, is a known risk in construction, can often be mitigated, or is expected within certain tolerances for a given location. This distinction is vital for understanding risk allocation. It keeps weather impacts generally within the project time-cost adjustment mechanisms, rather than the drastic termination options.
Okay, so if a genuine exceptional event does occur, what happens?
Consequences of an exceptional event, subclause 18.4. If a contractor is the affected party and suffers delay and/or incurs costs due to an exceptional event, they are entitled to an EOT. And for certain types of events, specifically those related to war, rebellion, terrorism, riots, strikes, or encountering dangerous materials occurring in the country, they are also entitled to payment of such cost. Not all exceptional events automatically grant cost recovery, only time relief. The affected party must give a notice of the exceptional event within 14 days of becoming aware of it. They are then excused from performing the prevented obligations from the date of prevention, or from the date of notice if you've been late. This provides relief when performance becomes truly impossible.
Can it lead to termination?
Yes, under optional termination, subclause 18.5. If the execution of substantially all the works in progress is prevented for a continuous period of 84 days by an exceptional event, or for multiple periods totaling more than 140 days due to the same event, then either party may give notice to the other to terminate the contract. Termination takes effect 7 days after the notice is received. The contractor is then paid for the value of work done, the cost of plant and materials ordered, which then become the employer's property, and the cost of removing contractor's equipment. This mechanism provides a structured way to end a project when circumstances truly make continued performance impossible or impractical, ensuring the contractor is fairly compensated for work completed and commitments made, rather than being financially ruined by something completely outside their control.
With all these risks we've discussed, design faults, ground conditions, exceptional events, how does the Red Book ensure they're adequately covered by insurance? And maybe what's a common oversight regarding insurance in these complex contracts?
Insurance is indeed a key component of risk mitigation in FIDIC, addressed comprehensively in Clause 19. The Red Book places a clear obligation on the contractor to provide and maintain comprehensive insurance policies. Typically, these are required to be in the joint names of both the contractor and the employer. This dual naming is important. It ensures both parties have direct protection under the policies and can potentially claim directly. A common oversight is not fully understanding the nuances of these joint names and exactly what they imply for claim procedures or policy control.
What kind of insurance is usually required?
The required insurances generally include several key types. Insurance of the works and contractor's documents, subclause 19.2.1. The contractor must insure the works, including materials and plant for incorporation, for their full replacement value from commencement date until the taking over certificate is issued. This cover usually extends to an additional 15%, or other stated amount, to cover incidental costs like professional fees, demolition, debris removal. Importantly, the insurance typically covers loss and damage resulting from failures of elements defectively designed or constructed, even if the contractor is responsible for the design, though policy specifics matter here. Then, insurance of goods, subclause 19.2.2. This covers goods and other things brought to the site by the contractor, usually for their full replacement value, including delivery, from arrival until no longer required. Liability for breach of professional duty, subclause 19.2.3. This is essentially professional indemnity, PI, insurance. It's particularly relevant, often essential, if the contractor has design obligations under the contract. It indemnifies the contractor against liability from acts, errors, or omissions in their design work that result in the works not being fit for purpose. This cover must often be maintained for several years after project completion.
And general liability.
Yes, injury to persons and damage to property, subclause 19.2.4. This covers liabilities for death or injury to any person or loss damage to any property other than the works themselves, arising out of the performance of the contract, occurring before the performance certificate is issued. It generally excludes loss caused by exceptional events, as those are handled separately.
What if the contractor just doesn't get the insurance?
FIDIC anticipates that too. The contract states, subclause 19.1, that if the contractor fails to effect or maintain any required insurances, the employer has the right to effect and keep those insurances in force themselves and recover the premium costs from the contractor, usually by deducting from payments due. The guidance notes strongly stress getting professional advice when altering insurance provisions. Incorrectly modifying these clauses can inadvertently shift significant liabilities onto a party that might not be prepared or adequately covered. It's a complex area where expert legal and insurance consultation is vital. It's definitely not just about ticking a box.
Absolutely. Now, this is a really modern twist. FIDIC, these forms, were developed long before digital models were commonplace. How does something like building information modeling, or BIM, fit into this traditional contract framework? And what are the unexpected challenges when you try to integrate it?
That's a great question, and it's where FIDIC's forward-thinking approach shines through. particularly in its advisory notes to users, which address BIM specifically. They acknowledge straight up that BIM is fundamentally different from traditional contract conditions. BIM isn't a legal framework itself, it's a sophisticated mechanism, really an environment designed for shared access to project information. It fosters collaboration among employer, contractor, engineers, subcontractors, everyone. The goal is often a combined or federated digital model integrating design, specs, data from all disciplines.
So IFDIC sees itself as compatible with BIM.
Yes. The advisory notes explicitly state that FIDIC contracts are considered suitable for BIM projects, provided the parties recognize BIM's different approach and use the contract appropriately. In fact, BIM can significantly reduce variations and improve efficiency, especially in more integrated project delivery models like design-build, or even more so design-build-operate, where that early, proactive involvement of all parties is essential. The improved quality and accessibility of information within a BIM environment can lead to a substantial reduction in the kind of misunderstandings and clashes that often plague traditional projects, potentially saving massive amounts of time and money.
But what are the pitfalls, the unexpected challenges you mentioned?
The advisory notes highlight specific, sometimes unexpected, risks associated with working in a BIM environment that FIDIC users really must address contractually. Misunderstanding scope of services. It becomes crucial to clearly define BIM deliverables. What level of detail, level of information is required from whom and when? To avoid confusion about responsibilities within the digital model, this includes defining roles like information manager or BIM coordinator. Use of data for inappropriate purpose and reliance on inappropriate data. This is a big one. With shared models and common databases, there's a risk data might be used for purposes it wasn't intended for, or parties might rely on data that isn't fully verified yet, potentially leading to costly errors down the line. Ensuring data integrity, version control, appropriate use protocols. The contract needs to specify who owns the data at different stages and who's liable if it's misused.
Right, data management becomes critical.
Absolutely. Which leads to ineffective information, document, or data management. The success of BIM hinges on robust systems. Without clear protocols, naming conventions, data hierarchies, access rights, the benefits of BIM can quickly turn into digital chaos. And a major one today, cybersecurity and responsibility for holding models data. With shared digital models, cybersecurity is a huge concern. There must be clear assignment of responsibility for protecting the integrity, confidentiality, accessibility of the combined models and data. Who bears the risk of a cyber attack or data breach? This often requires specialist advice and specific clauses in the particular conditions, including data breach protocols.
So new roles might be needed.
Yes, the advisory notes recommend a qualified individual manage the combined BIM model distinct from the project manager to ensure clear responsibility. This person needs expertise in data backup, integrity, continuity planning, cybersecurity. Professional indemnity insurers should also be consulted about coverage for this specialized, relatively new role.
How do you tie this all together contractually?
The notes emphasize that all subcontractors should be bound by the BIM protocol and the BIM execution plan, key operational documents in a BIM project. The dispute resolution processes should also be reviewed to ensure they suit the collaborative nature of BIM. And legal counsel should carefully review the contract to ensure that integrating BIM doesn't unintentionally create things like joint ventures, which can have significant legal implications. Ultimately, it's about adapting the legal framework to foster collaboration without blurring those critical lines of responsibility and liability.
So it's not just about the tech itself, but how the contract actively adapts to both leverage the tech and mitigate its new risks. That's a fantastic example of how a FIDIC evolves, even if the core principles remain solid. It truly highlights the dynamic nature of these foundational documents.
Precisely. It shows the framework isn't static.
Wow, what a deep dive into the FEI First Red Book 2017. I mean, from the meticulous definitions and that stringent 28-day notice period, all the way to the robust, multi-tiered dispute resolution mechanisms. It's crystal clear that this isn't just some dry legal document gathering dust. It's a living, breathing global standard that actively shapes how monumental construction projects come to life every day. We've really seen how it carefully balances the roles of the employer, contractor, and engineer, how it anticipates the truly unexpected, and even how it's ingeniously designed to integrate with cutting-edge practices like BIM, allowing for potentially remarkable efficiency.
Yes, and if we connect this to the bigger picture, the FIDIC Red Book really empowers parties to navigate the inherent complexities and high risks of construction with, ideally, greater clarity and fairness. It's testament, I think, to the power of well-defined processes and balanced risk allocation, transforming what could otherwise be potential chaos into structured, more predictable progress. And its adaptability, as shown by its thoughtful integration with modern practices like BIM, ensures its continued relevance and importance in an ever-evolving global industry.
So what does this all mean for you listening in? Well, next time you see a massive bridge going up, or maybe a new building changing your city skyline, you might just think about the intricate dance happening behind the scenes. That dance of contracts, clauses, and collaboration, all guided by frameworks like the FIDIC Red Book. It really does make you appreciate the unseen foundations, the legal and procedural ones, that literally build our world.
Absolutely. And thinking forward, this raises an important question, doesn't it? In a world increasingly driven by digital collaboration, perhaps artificial intelligence aiding project management, and rapidly evolving construction methods like modular or off-site construction,
Hmm.
how might future iterations of standard contracts like FEI continue to adapt? How do they balance those established vital legal principles with the need for even greater agility and real-time problem-solving on a truly global scale?
Yeah.
How much more flexible can they become without losing that fundamental balance they strive for?
Something to definitely mull over as you look at the buildings around you. Thanks so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging for knowledge.